Let's take a look now at linear functions and how they relate to the equation and the points that we use to generate them. So let's say, for example, that we had the linear function y equals 4x minus 1. Now, on your homework, you're given both this statement and the graph that represents it. But we're going to kind of build them all together right now. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is generate a table. And your tables can be vertical or horizontal. We've done several of the vertical type, so let's do a horizontal table. So let's say that we're looking for specific information. Let's again start with -1, 0, 1, and let's say 3 for our x or domain values. And we're going to need to find the corresponding range values. So we'll find those really quickly by saying y equals 4x minus 1 and see what happens when x is a -1. 4 times a -1 is a -4. -4 minus 1 is a -5. So when x is -1, y is a -5. So we'll go ahead and fill that in on our chart, and we'll also go ahead and graph that while we're at it. When x is a -1, y is a -5. Okay, let's look at another point here. So we have y equals 4 times x minus 1, and this time our x value will be 0. So 4 times 0 is 0, and 0 minus 1 is a -1. So in this case, when x is 0, y is a -1. So alright, so let's go ahead and graph that point. When x is 1, y is 3. And our last x value getting plugged in here. So we have y equals 4 times x minus 1. This time our x value is 3. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 minus 1 is 11. So when x is 3, y is 11. And that one we can't quite graph, goes right off our page. So we have these 3 lines that we can go ahead, or 3 points that we can connect into a line. Now, on your homework, it asks you specifically to identify 3 points on the graph, make a table, and record the coordinates of each point. We've done that, right? We've identified 3 points on the graph, we've made a table, and we've recorded the coordinates of each. Then it asks us to write the domain and range of the set of points. So let's go ahead, see if we can shrink this down a little bit. So we can write the domain and range. So our domain values and our range values. The domain values, remember, are the x values, or those values right there. And we can write them from smallest to largest. So we have -1, 0, 1, and 3. The range values are the y values, or these values. Okay, here we go. Let's try another one of these. This time, let's say that we have y equals 2/3 x minus 1. first thing we were asked to do is identify 3 points on the graph. And if the line is already drawn on, that's easy enough to do. We're actually going to generate our table first, which will help us find the points that we're looking for. So here's our table with x and y values. We only need 3. The x values that I'm going to choose, I'm getting a little predictable here, but they're the easiest to work with. -1, 0, and 1. So let's go ahead and work this through. So we have y equals 2/3 x minus 1. And when x is a -1, that gives us a -2/3 minus 1, which is a -1 and 2/3. So when x is a -1, y is a -1 and 2/3. So we'll go ahead and plug that in to our table, and we'll graph it as well. When x is a -1, y is a -1 and 2/3. And this might be a little tricky. It's hard to see around my stylus. So kind of there-ish. That's not quite down far enough, but hopefully you get the idea. So let's try another one here. We have y equals 2/3 times x minus 1. This time our x value is 0. Anything times 0 is 0, so we'll bring down the -1. 0 minus 1 is just a -1. So in this case, when x is 0, y is a -1. So we can plug that in to our table and graph it as well. When x is 0, y is a -1. -1-ish. Okay, last one. We have y equals 2/3 x minus 1. And this time x is a +1. So we get 2/3 minus 1. So we get a -1/3. So when x is 1, y is a -1/3. So going to our graph, when x is 1, y is a -1/3.